and welcome back to Homebrewing DIY, the show that takes on the do-it-yourself aspect of homebrewing. Gadgets, contraptions, and parts. This podcast covers it all. On today's show, we're talking to George Duncan of Barley and Hops Brewing. He has a great YouTube channel, and he's based in Copperas Cove, Texas. And today we're going to talk about a chiller that he's built out of a window AC unit and a cooler. We're also going to discuss his YouTube channel and all the great topics that you can see. You should check it out. But first, I want to ask all of my listeners for a little bit of help. I'm going to do a year-end show between Christmas and New Year's, and I want it to be about homebrew hacks. What is a homebrew hack, you ask? Well, it's something that you figured out to make your brew day easier. Is it a gadget that you've built, or something you do to your system that's truly unique? I'm going to read them on the air for the final show of the year. So, I would like to start asking for submissions now. So please email me your homebrew hacks to podcast@Homebrewing DIY Beer. No matter how big or how small your hack is, I want to hear it. And please use the subject homebrew hacks in the subject line of your email. Once again, send your homebrew hack to podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. And did you know that you could follow the show on social media? We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram under the handle @homebrewingdiy, all one word. The show so far has been going strong for about 3 months now, and it's been pretty awesome adventure so far. Our listenership has been growing steadily, and as we grow, the show is going to need your support. Please support the show on Patreon. You can get an ad-free episode and bonus content if you head over to patreon.com/homebrewingdiy. You can give as little as $1 a month to remove the ads from this show. You can also support us by giving us a review on podchaser.com, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Your reviews help others find this show. The last way you can support the show is to head over to the website homebrewingdiy.beer and use some of our sponsor links like Brewfather, the brewing software. It's a very powerful and easy to use piece of software. It's by far my favorite, and I have to admit, I've pretty much used them all. From recipe creation to walking through your brew day, Brewfather is the best. Go to homebrewingdiy.beer, click on the Brewfather banner, and sign up today. Feedback. You can always send feedback to podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. We would love to hear from you. Now, let's get into our show and talk to George Duncan about his DIY air conditioning controlled chiller. I'd like to introduce George Duncan from Barley and Hops Brewing. He has a great YouTube channel. Highly recommend you check it out. It's got quite a following. And today we're going to talk about some of the really amazing projects that he's done on his channel. And so I'd like to welcome George. Welcome to Homebrewing DIY.
Oh, thank you so much. I do appreciate it. This is a great experience.
Well, I'm glad to have you on the show, and we're excited to talk to you. You're in Texas. Why don't you give us a bit of background of kind of how you started the YouTube channel and kind of how it's morphed into what it is today?
Oh, certainly, yeah. And any time that we can share information with the community, because that's our sole focus, is sharing transparent information and the truth about brewing and distilling. I retired out of the military after 35 years of service. So, after doing that, the wife and I, we invested in a bunch of different things. We actually bought a building here, and it had an empty room upstairs, a little alcove. And, I was complaining all the time about not having a brew shop nearby. And this is back in 2012. And my wife just looked at me and said, "Hey, you've been complaining about it all this time. You got an empty spot, get off your butt. You ain't doing anything else." So we did. We actually opened up a brew shop, and it took off very well. We started getting a great following, and things started happening. And I started to do a little bit of my own advertising. So I did a couple of videos, and they were hitting pretty good. And I was like, this is not a bad deal, And what I found was that the information I was looking for at that point as a shop owner, retailer, and as a home brewer myself, It was just, there was a lot of information that was lacking, and especially when we started to move into the distilling process, which is something was in my family and a bunch of other families. And so I dedicated myself I said, somebody needs to tell the truth. So I started doing these videos, and I was not prepared initially at the results and the response I got from the community that has grown now to, we've got millions and millions of hits and views. We're working our way close to 50,000 subscribers. And, I really appreciate, my heart goes out to every one of them, because subscribe to a channel is the way that a channel stays alive. And this channel lives on only because of our subscribers and the community at large.
Yeah, I was actually looking for a specific project, and your channel came up, and I was surprised at the size of your community, and not only that, how active your community was in kind of driving the content on your site.
They really do. And that's what's most impressive and heartwarming is that, I read the comments every day. I go through all of those and I answer them, or just respond with a like, because there's so many of them. But to listen to and reading the comments back and forth, and then the conversations that develop in the comment section. I don't know if most people understand that on a YouTube channel, when you comment below, everybody else gets to see your comment. And oh, by the way, you can spark up a conversation with someone else. And I get most of our ideas in our queries really from a lot of those comments. And sometimes it's a little bit off base. It may not be 100% accurate, but it's accurate to the writer. And so I try to delve into it, and I'll start to test and experiment or demonstrate in any way, fashion that I can to try to lend some clarity to it. Or in many cases, this will happen. I'll mention a name and say, hey, thanks to, person, whoever, showed me this, and then I'll demonstrate that and go, this was a great idea that I was not aware of. So yeah, the community really wraps its arms around each other. We put out a net call one time. I've got a blind distiller. This guy is 100% blind, and he was interested in some of the products, some of the things that we're working on, like the PID controller, which you're very familiar with. And to a blind person, a PID controller is useless unless you can hear it. And we couldn't find anywhere. I reached out to the community, and the outpour of support of people wanting to donate to it, to get involved in it. And a lot of people did. And my heart goes, again, my thanks, because if it wasn't for the community, we would not have been able to build that audible PID controller and then take it down and deliver it to Mike. And so he uses that thing religiously. And it's just one of those heartwarming stories where this community just galvanized itself together for a good cause.
Yeah, I have to admit that, our last episode of this show was on homebrew clubs and the community built around those. But in all reality, even with online communities, for me, I find my home on the Reddit homebrewing forum. I have friends that I've known there for years, since I started homebrewing almost a decade ago. And it's the same thing. I feel like there are people there that I've only met online, yet I feel very close to, and sometimes as close to as some of the people that I do brew with in person. So yeah, it's amazing how amazing the homebrewing community really is, and just, how supportive it is. And and speaking of some of the projects, because I have a DIY homebrewing show, and to be honest, yours is very much a DIY channel. The project that really drew me in was the AC controller you used to cool water with.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'd kind of like to dive into that project a bit, and really, what were you trying to achieve with it? And then after that, we'll dive into kind of how you built it. So what was the challenge you were having?
Well, the challenge, and this one falls right into the distilling community. The challenge was, when you run a still, you're going to run it. It, of course, takes a lot of energy, a lot of heat. And it's a controlled process, but the output is going to be a hot vapor, and you condense that hot vapor back to a liquid, and that liquid is alcohol. But what happens is that the water that you run through the condenser, as it's removing all of that heat, the water gets hot. Now you got one or two choices here. You can either run your tap, which now you're paying for water, or you can get a big cooler and put a pump into it, and pump the water out of the cooler and just recycle the water. But when you do that, the water gets hot, so it starts to lose its ability to condense. So the solution for that is, well, add ice. And you just continuously add ice and, it maintain a certain temperature, which is just cool, until you're finished your run. Now, in my case, and in a lot of people's experiences, this may take 30, 40, 50 pounds of ice because you're doing this for a couple of hours. So that becomes a little bit costly. So we started to look for other solutions. So that's what this was born out of. It was born out of a search for a solution to a lifelong problem that a lot of us had experienced. And, I started working with Peltier devices. I was trying to develop, a way to super chill water and use it and recirculate that. And, I'm still working on that, but there's some challenges because it's not that efficient. And then I looked over and by golly, there was a 5,000 BTU air conditioner that I had sitting around for 20 years. And, everybody knows how an air conditioner works, it's hot on one side and it's cold on the other. And so I just theorized that would work. You think?
Yeah. And to be honest, you're the cool thing is that you're not the first person to come to this realization. And I've seen a lot of different takes on the same thing.
Different adaptations.
Yeah. But in all reality, it's almost like that AC unit was almost made to condense water in a cooler. It's like the way that they're built and the way that the pipes can kind of set in is how that works.
And just so you'll know, just in all honesty, it wasn't my idea. Again, it was a community. I had a lot of comments about, different ways that what they were using. I had one guy that was running his condenser through an old refrigerator freezer. And I was like, now that's ingenious. It's constantly cold in there. So he was just recirculating his water through the freezer. And I was like, see, there are many, many ways of doing this.
Yeah. Different approaches to engineering the same problem, right?
Exactly.
So why don't you describe to me what you actually built and kind of how it worked? It basically, if you could explain it to us in an audio format, kind of how you engineered this project.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't the hardest part, but the most delicate part was the disassembly. I got a 90 quart cooler, and I got a couple of them laying around. Most people have one of them, them large coolers. Some of them have wheels on them. But I wanted to use something large enough that was going, I'd be able to control and, use for a whole bunch of different processes. So I just took this thing up, I took the lid off, and I mounted the 5,000 BTU air conditioner on top after I got it all disassembled. And on the back side of it, where the hinges mate, I cut a hole, sawed off probably 3 inches into the lid itself and about 3 inches wide, like a square. And what that was for was to allow the copper tubing from the evaporator to fold down inside. So this was the tricky part. Now, for those who don't understand or may not clearly understand, the way an air conditioner works really is it just produces high pressure with a pump on one end. And that goes through a small valve, and pressure and temperature are proportionate. So when you lower the pressure, which is it goes through this small valve and it explodes, it comes out, it flashes, and the temperature drops dramatically from somewhere up in the 200s all the way down to it's somewhere close to zero in some cases. It just depends on the mixture. And then that runs through the evaporator, and then air flows across the evaporator and condenses. The water runs off of it. Then you have cold air that comes out the other side. Well, guess what? That thing is so cold, if you place that into a liquid, into water, that water acts just like the flow of air, and anything that comes in contact with it and flows by it will immediately cool as well. So it's sort of like, the aha moment. I pulled that apart and had it sitting up on a table. And I got a video on that. If you go to our YouTube channel, you can see the video of how we actually did that. In order to, it can be problematic if you get a little bit too manly with it, I guess. And if you're aggressive, because you could pop one of those copper lines, and then you got to reseal it, and then of course refill it. But if you're gentle with it, you can bend that copper line and that evaporator once you take the screws out of it, where it's seated against the frame, and you can just bend that straight down. And what that really makes is an upside down almost kind of looking air conditioner. So you got the coils that are sitting inside the cooler, and the air conditioner sits on top of the cooler, and all the heat's dissipated from the back of it, and voila, you fill it with water, turn it on, and I can cool 20 gallons or so of water from an average here in Texas when I was doing this. In the summertime, it probably comes out of the tap at 78 or so, 80 degrees. I can cool that down to about 40 degrees in 30 minutes. And I can keep it there. That's because the water that goes, the water that comes out of there with a pump, I just pump the water out with a small pump. It pumps right into my condenser, and then when it comes out of the condenser, it goes into the other end of the cooler. So what it does is it causes the water to flow as well at the same time. So I killed two birds with one stone, and it works extremely well.
And what is the actual temperature you're trying to hold at? Like, what is it that, for example, for distilling, I got to be honest, I've personally only homebrewed beer. What is the temperature you're trying to keep as a constant through that condensation phase to get it to come together?
Yeah, well, it vaporizes it. Well, there's a scientific answer for that. 173.8 degrees or 78.8 or 78.6 Celsius. So that's the temperature of the vapor. What you have to do is you have to drop that down by about 10 degrees. It doesn't take a whole lot. So in order to be efficient, though, you need to bring it down as far as you can. Now, believe it or not, 70 degrees or 80 degrees would do it. But the problem in that is that over a period of about the first 30 minutes, your water is no longer that temperature because it goes through, picks up heat, and goes back into the cooler. So it starts to get really hot. And then you run into a problem where you can no longer transfer heat efficiently. That's a thermodynamic effect. And then, of course, then you stop condensing. So you need to get it down as far as you can. You don't need to be freezing. It really doesn't need to be 40 degrees. But if you can keep it in the 60-degree range, it is more than effective and efficient to condense. And oh, by the way, just because you're a beer brewer, understand that everything you do, and winemakers and distillers, is exactly the same thing, with the exception of you bottle, winemakers bottle, and distillers separate. It's the only difference.
Yeah, the fermentation process is still the same. It's really just the difference between distilling and other beverages is the actual distilling portion.
Yeah, what you do with it when you get to when you get to the end,
Exactly. And then and the other question is that, for me, this design of, this water chiller has other effects. It can be used for brewing. It could be used for brewing. I could think in a couple ways. One way I could think of right now is that if I were to use a similar project when trying to cool down my wort from a boil, right? So, for example, if I had that pumping through my immersion chiller, that would be one way of keeping my groundwater temperature low, and since it's cycling through, I'm not wasting water, one, and B, I'm not adding ice to it, right? That could be one example of that use.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, see, there are so many adaptations for this, and there's so many problems that you can resolve. I mean, but now this is not a solution looking for a problem, mind you. This was a problem experienced and a solution developed by many other people as well. So yeah, you can use it for a lot of different things. Anything you need to use to cool with, you can. Except for something like cryogenics, you're not going to do that.
Yeah, that's a little too cold.
That's a little bit.
But then I've also seen a very similar setup where people will take this exact setup where you take the 5,000 BTU unit, you're going to then, cut the notches out in the cooler, add the condenser side to that. And then what I've seen is they add water to it, just like you did, but then they add a little glycol to it. And so, for example, when they've added glycol to it, they can get the temperature even lower, closer to freezing, and then they use it for, if let's say you had a conical fermenter that doesn't fit in a refrigerator, you could line it with the lines, insulated, of course, have the PID controllers added to it, and then be able to actually maintain fermentation chambers with a very similar setup.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, so you see, and this can, there's something else that this is really good for, and I've seen it in action. I went into a high class bar. I very seldom do that. Okay. I'm a regular kind of guy, but I walked into a high class bar, and I can't remember which city it was in, but the bar top had about a 6-inch river that ran through the center of it. And you could see it, but it was glass it was like a glass on the top, and it was glycol that was running through it. And what that was for, so that, while you're drinking your beer, you put your beer down on that, and it kept it cool. So, you weren't sitting on them. Maybe it's a little bit extreme, but I mean, that was the purpose of it. So it was a chilled bar top. It was only about 6 inches in depth, and it's set right in the middle of the bar. So, you put your beer up there, and it never got hot or never got warm. It just stayed cold. And they use a very similar setup, from what I understand now, to cool that glycol that they were running through the top of the bar.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I just a bit of history on me is I did come from the bar and restaurant business, and the bar that I used to run 15 years ago, it's been a long time. That bar had a very, very long beer line. Like, the walk-in fridge was probably 500 or 600 feet from the actual tap, and we had a dual glycol system that basically did exactly that. Refrigerated the glycol, ran it along the lines through the entire run, and then made it so that when it came out the tap, it was cold the whole way. That's also another use. You could take this, cooler full of glycol, insulate the lines with your beer lines. Let's say you had let's say your refrigeration. Yeah, I've heard of people running their beer taps to their kitchen, for example. This would be the solution to doing that, because you could keep the beer cold in the line all the way to your, point of pouring.
Absolutely. Yeah. And these are some of the little things, that we pick up here and there, as issues arise, we try to find a solution, or we reach out to the community. They give us the solution, and then I'll put together a video on it and share that with everybody else, because there's no such thing as a bad idea if it works.
I completely agree. Let's talk about some other projects that you've done on the channel. I know you guys do a lot of testing, different brewing methods. Can you talk about maybe some recent tests that you've done that have really stood out to you?
Yeah. Matter of fact, I did a video today. It wasn't as much of a test as it was a demonstration, all different various yeast strains, from beer yeast to wine, to cider. Oh gosh, Fleischmann's bread yeast that a lot of people really like, and then distiller's yeast. So I did one of those today, but we take a really good practical approach. I did a shot a couple weeks ago I think it was last week, on sake and rice, because you theorize, you understand this as well, being a brewer, that you're converting starches to fermentable sugars, and
yep.
Yeah, and I mean, and even in almost every distilling recipe, you'll have a bunch of grains and base products, but you'll always have barley in there. And we all understand, barley has 2-row barley's got a diastatic power of like 140 or so. It takes 30 diastatic power points to convert itself, and the rest converts anything with it. So that amylase enzyme is converting all of those starches to fermentable sugars. So, you think about it, and you're like, well, rice is primarily about 90% starch. So, why can't we convert that? And I had a lot of people write in and ask that question, can you use amylase to convert rice? And I said, well, let's find out. So we actually did a test, and we do a side-by-side test with each one. I use different types of rice in different environments, all equal and measured out. And then we tested every one of those and come to find out that our initial gravity before using amylase was 1.000 water. And then after amylase, it was 1.000. So the answer to the question at that point was, well, no, amylase will not convert rice to fermentable sugars. And then I thought, well, let me just leave this. So 18 hours later, I checked it again, and I got the same results. So I thought maybe there was a time factor involved in that, because I've had people tell me that they do that. And for the life of me now, I can't understand how they do it, but I say that I've done the test. Now, if someone else can find a way to do it, do the test and show me. Now, here's what I did learn, because I've done a lot of research on it. All rice is polished. And when you remove the husk and the germ from the outside of the rice, which leaves it as a piece of starch, and it's just white, it's so concentrated. Had we left the germ, the potential of converting that, which is naturally what it would do, that germ does that, converts that rice to fermentable sugars. So since we've removed all of that, it makes rice a very complex starch that cannot be converted by amylase, based on my experience, though.
Well, and if you're talking about sake, I mean, isn't that essentially kind of what the koji does? Is that kind of breaks it down so that it can convert to sugar?
Exactly. And so, yeah, it's koji kin, and just it's like a dust, but it's spores. And you allow these spores to grow on the rice itself. And you keep it in an oven for like at 86 degrees for 30. It takes 30 hours to grow this. And you're actually growing a mold on the rice. And then you introduce that with another batch of fresh rice that you've steamed. And when that goes into a fermenter, the most fantastic thing to watch is this starts to convert that rice to fermentable sugars at the same time that it's fermenting, because you add yeast with it at the same time. So you've got this process happening that most of us are accustomed to. You do your preparation, you do your starch conversions, you do your measurements, you understand what your potentials are going to be, so you can do some predictions. But with sake, you're actually doing the conversion and the fermentation at the same time, which kind of leaves your hands free. You can't test it. It almost makes you wonder. You can guess it what your alcohol percentage is, but you're not going to get an accurate figure. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but all agreed. But then the idea is that you can get pretty close so that you're not like overdoing it, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, you still know how much how, like, for example, I know that if I put 12 pounds of grain into a batch of beer, I know generally what the gravity is going to be, right? And I think that would be the same with rice, though you're not. I may be off a few points here and there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can get a ballpark figure. And believe it or not, I had one of my viewers, and I take calls all day long, every day. That's great. And he told me, he said, George, he says, after listening to your YouTube channel, I figured out, he goes, it doesn't really matter almost what I use. It's normally 30 gravity points per pound per gallon. I was like, well, yeah, it's, now there are some things that, are 34 gravity points per gallon, per pound per gallon. There are some that are 25, but yeah, and generally speaking, a pound per gallon is about 30 gravity points. So you got a good point there.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, obviously, if you really muck it up and, like, for example, going back to beer here, if you were to not hit a proper mashing temperature, you're definitely going to lose some. You're definitely going to have some issues.
You'll lose efficiencies. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you try to mash it 130, you're not going to convert, right? So
exactly.
So for example, then you're not going to get that 30 points. But if you are sticking to the process, which is the right temperatures and and the amount of water is equal to the amount, like, for example, if you don't water it down too much, because if you add more water to it, you just dilute the solution. Yeah. But the idea is that you could generally tell. So totally, it's funny. so much math involved in brewing, but then to me, there's just that touch of art, and they kind of merge together, right?
Yeah, there's an art, a science, and a skill. I think that goes, that perfect blend of those three things, the perfect trifecta. And somebody who's really successful is just, this is George's opinion, is look, if you can follow instructions and not try to outthink it. And I use this term a lot, this description. When it comes to distilling, I'm like, this is a 10th grade science project. And the thing is, I give it to a 10th grader, and they get it right every time. My gosh, I got Mike down, and he's blind, and he does it, and he gets it right all the time, and he's very successful. But normally, you give it to a middle-aged man. For some reason, we want to outthink it.
Yeah, but I also think that it has to do with it, and being somebody who's given advice to a lot of brewers over the time that I have been brewing, and also from being a newbie at some point, it's almost there's a certain level of patience involved that I think when you're brand new, you don't get, right? So, hey, I want to go open a fermenter while it's at high cruising. You just don't want to do that. Those kinds of things, right? So for me, it's like I would say the number one thing to learn when making any alcoholic beverage, whether it be sake, wine, beer, spirits, patience,
cider.
Wait.
Yes.
When you think you should open it, give it another week.
And hey, another thing I'd also add to that is that consider your source, because there is so much misinformation. You can ask most people about brewing, and most of them, for some reason, they feel obligated to tell you everything they know, and a lot of them have never brewed, but they still feel obligated to give you all the advice in the world. And a lot of it is, hearsay, like, well, yeah, you throw this in, but then you turn over here, you look that way, and if you set the bucket the right way, you make sure the sun's only on half of it. That's the only way it's going to work. I was like, where did you get that from? So we try to dispel a lot of the rumors, folklore. One in particular is methanol. I know you've heard it as well.
Oh yeah.
If you drink that methanol, you're going to go blind. And so I use this description. You make beer, and then you bottle it. A winemaker makes his wine, and he bottles it. I run it in a still, and I separate the methanol. I've done something neither the beer maker or the winemaker has done, which means that you've diluted the methanol and you spread it out, and you're still drinking it. Nobody's gone blind. My point is you will not create enough methanol in a still to make you go blind or to kill you. There's more methanol in a half a gallon of apple juice that you get from the grocery store than you'll ever make. So, we try to dispel the folklores and the myths, because there's a whole lot of history and science that goes into that it's real easy to misunderstand, because you hear it one time, it's so drastic. If you drink that, you go blind. Well, yeah, there was a time when that was happening, but there's a story behind that, and there's some data and facts that back that up. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, and the story behind it is really that's people adding alcohol to things they shouldn't have been adding alcohol to, right? So
exactly,
it's like
during Prohibition, the government was making methanol because they still needed it for clinical purposes, and some unscrupulous, bootleggers, they'd get their hands on a barrel of that. They didn't know any better, so they were using that to spike. And they'd spike it, and wind up they call it the Jake Walk. I could talk for hours about the period of Prohibition and some of the history and the presidents and but that's probably good for another show.
Yeah, but it is something to be said where it's like there are myths out there. Obviously, distilling technically is not legal in the United States, so that is something to kind of let the users know.
You're right.
Is that to buy all of the equipment to do it, to get all the way up to the process of doing it, totally legal, but the actual act of distilling is technically illegal. I will say I don't know a single distiller who's been arrested unless they were out trying to sell it. So take that for what it is.
Very true.
Very true.
I just say, distiller beware. There are a couple. There's one state in particular. It'll come. Oh, Missouri. Missouri treats distilling like they do beer and wine. 200 gallons a year per adult in the household.
Yeah, which is awesome. But I can tell you that I've had bourbon made by my friends, and it's great.
Oh,
I've had great whiskey made by homebrewers who dabble in both. And I have to admit that I've had some great spirits made by brewers that do a really amazing job and take the same care, consideration, and effort that they would put into making any of their best beers go into the same craft that there is in distilling. So,
absolutely. There's an equal amount of love to the process of, especially craft beer brewers. My goodness, I'm so impressed. I've tried, I've done well with beer. I've done well with wine. I do well with spirits, but there's a love that's attached to that art. And they're all equal. I mean, a distiller loves what he does, and he doesn't do it to break the law. A beer brewer doesn't do it to save money. It can be costly, but it can be economical as well. But really, they're doing that. It's a love for the challenge, the hobby, the experience. I'm
gonna say this out loud, and hopefully I could tell you that I got a 50-50 shot of my wife actually listening to this. But when I started brewing, trust me, I was like, hey babe, don't worry, I'm going to get into brewing. It's going to be so much cheaper. But I always knew deep down that it wasn't going to be cheaper. It was all about, the processes. And because that's actually what I am. I'm a process guy. To make a cup of coffee for me is a process, let alone making a beer. And so the idea is that that's at least what drives me. And when I talk to people in my homebrew club and I talk to other brewers on the show or wherever I talk to brewers, that is actually, I think, what drives people is the process and the final result from that process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, anybody who watches our channel, they'll tell you I'm a data point guy. I'm like, okay. And I use that term a lot because it's so important in all of our processes and all of our tests that we do, all of our demonstrations. We always look for data points because data points tell you something, and you write those down. And it lets you know that if you're successful in this process, what you've just done is, what your data points are. Those are your milestones. And that's what you need to achieve in order to, what do we do as beer brewers? We always want to reproduce the best beer we ever made, right? We always want to do that. And the only way to do that is you need your set of data points or your milestones in order to get there. So it's such a cool hobby.
Well, and I always put out the challenge to people who make great beer. Hey, you made a great beer. Now do it 10 times, right? Because that's actually the hardest part of brewing is consistency. And people who brew the same beer consistently, that is actually the real talent of brewing.
Those are masters.
Yes, and to be honest, I brew. I've brewed for 10 years. I don't, I don't toot my own horn. I think I make pretty good beer. My friends tell me I make pretty good beer, but I could tell you that for me to make the same beer 5 or 6 times and have it be exactly the same every time is something I've never really been able to do. And that's because I don't have a system that I can dial in that way. I could do it on the fermentation side, but on my actual brew side, that's a little more difficult for me to do. And so for me, I think that when we talk about the mastery of brewing, and really, if you were to say, this is how I become a true master at this art and craft, that to me is where I say, hey, you've done what you've set out to do, is when you can not only brew great beer, but brew it consistently.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And another thing is being able to identify when things don't go right. And I'm a believer in anything and everything I've ever done. I want to know everything I could possibly know about it. From the far left to the far right of this process, so that and I want to be able to understand it. Technically, scientifically, and all of that, so that should something happen in the middle of that I'm not expecting. I'll have an understanding enough to know that it's probably because of this. I can point to it, and that I can address and either correct or fix for the next one. Because as you start fixing something, if you start fixing a whole bunch of things and then it does work, you'll never know what it was you fixed.
Exactly, and also the importance of keeping good notes whenever you brew.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Well, let's I got one more good question for you, which is, what was your biggest disaster of your brewing career when you've made something and what didn't work out?
Oh my goodness! Oh, yeah, you had to come with that one, yeah. Believe it or not, there are several. Okay, what if I just said everything? Everything about a particular brew that did not work right. I went in it. Again, having the distilling background from family, which was, believe it or not, nothing. I thought I knew something. But when I got into beer brewing itself, and I've brewed beer for probably 15 years or so. And then I got the store going. I was like, man, I can really take off with this. So I said, let me experiment and do some really neat stuff. I wanted to do a jalapeno beer. That was a disaster from start to finish because I was not prepared for what those jalapeno peppers, first of all, were going to do to the beer. And then my combination of a Citra hop with a Cascade, and then I think I put a Mount Hood in it as well. That was a total disaster that would make you want to vomit. It not only were things growing on it, I actually tasted it and I did get sick from it. So there's a lesson to be learned there that, sometimes you just can't sit back and go, well, I think I'm going to do this. If I throw a little bit of that in, I throw a little bit of this, everything will be fine. And now there's one other one that just rocked my world. I wanted to do some dry hopping, and I had it in a corny keg, and everything was fine. The beer was nice. It was a nice light ale. I had a really good crisp character to it, and everything was fine. And I said, man, I really want to dry hop this and get a lot more of that hop flavor. So I put a bunch of Centennial hops in a hop sock, and two of them actually. In the hop socks, I looked at my son and I said, hey, give me a couple of hop socks. And he did. Don't know where they came from. But I threw them in there, and about 2 weeks later, when I couldn't get the corny keg open because it had been pressurized, whatever was on those hop socks had a counter effect, and it grew a funk inside the corny keg. It built up pressure. I couldn't get it. I had to release the pressure, and I finally got it out. And when I opened it up, it smelled like turpentine. So that was a total failure. Again, and you go through those. Have I ever poured out a batch? You better believe it. But I've kept a lot more than I've poured out.
Me too. And I gotta say that if it's bad, just pour it out. It wasn't enough money to drink a keg of bad beer, guys.
yeah. And believe it or not, yeah, you're right. And once you really, don't ask me. I mean, how can I save this? You can't. I get a whole lot of the questions like, hey, well, can I do this? I say, well, can you? Yes. The real question is, should you? Should you do that is a better question to ask me, because you can do just about anything, but have you considered some of the second and third order effects?
Well, George, I want to thank you for coming on the show, really just kind of talking about your history and your YouTube channel and all the cool, amazing projects that you've done there. And we'll definitely have you back on the show again. I know that you're gonna always have you produce a lot of videos, and it's a lot of content to go through. If you're just, for any listeners, if you want to check out George's channel, it is called Barley and Hops Brewing, and just search for that on YouTube. It will come up. It's a great channel, and if you really want to get into some great homebrewing videos and spend a lot of time, because he's got a lot of videos, to really just dive into different projects, different tests that he's got going on. Learn a little bit about distilling. Learn a little bit about sake. You're definitely in for a treat if you watch George's channel. So
that's a high honor, and I appreciate that. It's so good to be here, and I appreciate you having me. I hopefully you'll have me back sometime. This is a pleasure.
Yeah, we'll definitely have you back. So thank you, George.
Okay, well, thank you.
I want to thank George for taking the time to talk with me today. And if you'd like more information, I'll have some embedded videos about what we talked about today from George's YouTube channel if you head over to homebrewingdiy.beer. George is a great guy, and you need to check out his channel, so we'll definitely have him back. And please support the podcast by heading over to patreon.com/homebrewingdiy. Well, that's it for today's show, and we'll see you all next week on Homebrewing DIY. Have you ever wanted to make a podcast? Do you have a subject you want to discuss with listeners? Do you even know where to start? Well, if you want to make a podcast and you want to get started now, I could not recommend Anchor enough. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. Anchor gives you everything you need in one place for free, which you can use right from your phone or computer. Creation tools allow you to record and edit your podcast so it sounds great. They'll distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard everywhere: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. And you can easily make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Hey, look, I shopped around for a place to post my podcast, and Anchor was the easiest, most streamlined experience you could ask for. So if you're looking for a place for your new podcast, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Once again, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. When I saw the YouTube channel for Barley and Hops Brewing, I knew I needed to talk to George, the creator of the channel. So today we're going to talk to George Duncan about how you can build a DIY chiller with an AC unit and a cooler. We're also going to talk about other projects like making sake and distilling and all kinds of things. So stick around and listen to George Duncan on Homebrewing DIY.